Good morning, Brian.
This story was the lead story in the Washington Post, suggesting that since 1998 we've had a covert effort to get Osama Bin Laden. Why have we not been successful?
Well, the story seems to be confirming what everyone suspected, which is required by law for the president to approve all covert operations by the CIA. It may be that we do have some sense of where Osama bin Laden is, but the reason why we haven't been able to get him or even predict what happened on Tuesday is basically because some of the flaws in our intelligence capabilities vis-a-vis terrorist groups. You know, a lot of people are making analogies to the mafia or the mob and trying to infiltrate terrorist groups. It's much more difficult, and you're starting to hear people from the intelligence community say, well, our hands have been tied. It is true that we have a prohibition based on I think some egregious behavior by the CIA in the 1970s and 80s. We have the United States prohibits the Central Intelligence Agency, or actually anyone in the United States government, from using what we call assets, using assets who are human rights violators, people within groups who may have committed other crimes. This prohibition didn't come out of the blue. It came up because it was learned in the 1980s that the CIA had on its payroll someone who was a member of a drug gang that was responsible for the torture and murder of an American citizen. And so afterwards, of course, there was an outcry, and the response was the CIA can no longer deal with bad people. The problem with that, of course, is terrorists are inherently bad people. You don't become or find out about terrorist groups without having known members of the group for a long time. In the case of Osama bin Laden, they all fought in the Afghan war together. You prove your stripes. So chances are that you only know about Osama bin Laden or what he's doing because you've killed someone. You are a human rights violator. So what we're starting to hear now in response to the failure of the CIA to learn anything about this is to give the CIA some more flexibility in its ability to basically hire bad people so that we can find out about much worse people.
In Judith Miller's piece in the New York Times this morning, at about her third or fourth paragraph, she says, as he has done before, Mr. bin Laden summoned Arab reporters on Wednesday to a compound in Afghanistan to deny responsibility for the stunning strikes while praising those who conducted them. What's this all about?
It's Osama bin Laden's MO is incredibly, it's the opposite of the 70s and 80s terrorism that we once knew, right? So in the 70s and 80s, people took responsibility for their terrorist incidents because they wanted to gain something out of it. Whether it was Palestinian terrorism, Irish terrorism, whatever, people wanted to gain some political benefits from the terrorism. So you had limited strategic terrorist strikes aimed at getting governments to move. And to be quite honest, in the cases of Yasser Arafat and the IRA, that was pretty successful. This is a new kind of terrorism where it's not entirely clear, except for hatred, what exactly is the desire of these terrorists except for to cause great harm. So instead of taking credit, they say, no, 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 that wasn't us. That was, you know, we're happy that it happened, but that wasn't us. What Osama bin Laden does do before each terrorist incident that we do ascribe to him, some of them proved, some of them not proved, as the case was with the USS Cole, is he sort of hints about it beforehand. So I think, or at least with USS Cole, with the Africa Embassy bombings, 4 to 5 weeks before, he'll often release a fatwa saying, Americans, be careful, you're going to be targeted. And he did that in this case as well, about 6 weeks ago.
Our guest is in Boston at this moment. She's Professor Juliette Kayyem of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She's the Executive Director of the Program of Domestic Preparedness. What is that?
Just to be clear, I'm not a professor. I just run the program.
But you have been a professor.
Yes, I have taught, and I served on the National Commission on Terrorism before I got to the Kennedy School. What that program does is basically we assess, and obviously this was before Tuesday, America's preparedness for a terrorist threat or a terrorist attack. Now, we'll be honest with you, people within the terrorism field, like myself, have been focusing extensive concentration in the last 10 years, ever since the Shanriko event in Japan, where nerve gas was used. Fortunately, only about a dozen people died in that case. With what we call WMD terrorism, weapons of mass destruction. And we generally define that as NBCR, nuclear, biological, chemical, or radiological devices. So we were sort of looking for the Armageddon, the new thing. And what we discovered on Tuesday was that good old, unfortunate 1970s style hijacking could be used as a sort of weapon of mass destruction, in this case much larger than anyone could have ever imagined. So what the domestic preparedness program does is, both in academic circles like myself and in the government, is it analyzes and attempts to strengthen America's response to a terrorism incident. Because as we're seeing in New York, even though this is an international crisis, it's something involving the president and the NSC and great diplomacy and NATO. In the end, the first people to get the phone calls are not Condoleezza Rice or President Bush. It's the 911 dispatcher who answers the call. So part of the domestic preparedness program has been to assist local and state entities in terms of their emergency preparedness, their ability to work in times of crisis, and also to buttress medical and health facilities, because for too long we've ignored our public health crisis. And as we see in a case like this, that is something that has to, basically has to get much stronger in America, because our hospitals are going to be inundated as they had been on Tuesday.
We want to ask you to join us if you're interested. The phone lines are on the screen there. You can see the East Central number at 737-001. That's an area code of 202. And then the second number is Mountain and Pacific zones, and the third one are 628-0205, Arab Americans. We'll take our first call from San Rafael, California. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, my name is Portia from San Rafael in California. This is obvious a tragedy that we all know, but I think it's an opportunity to look at ourselves. The greed in this company, the corporate greed, the horrible violent movies, which are just as violent as we've seen in this real tragedy. I think we should look at this capsulated version of horror, at the things that we do in this country. Not to say that we don't have to deal with terrorism, but we've also got to look at our history, where we have been aggressive, where we have supported other countries in aggression, regardless of their political views. We might be stepping in for not altruistic reasons, but through money, oil, greed, or whatever. So I think we're not just simply victims here. I think we've got to take a long, hard look at the way we conduct a lot of things in this country.
All right, thanks. Juliette Kayyem.
I mean, I think the caller has a point to the extent that these calls are what you're hearing about war and this war talk, which I think Americans do have to prepare themselves for, a long campaign. This is not going to be 2 o'clock in the morning airstrikes that we wake up to and learn that we strike some pharmaceutical company, as we did after the Africa embassy bombings. This will be sustained. Governments will likely topple, and America will probably be in parts of the world that we had never envisioned. That being the case, no one should think that the military solution is the end-all. This is going to require diplomacy and a long-term assessment of our relations with various parts of the world and the struggles within those parts of the world that we have too often ignored. The Arab world and certainly the Muslim world are not monolithic. People should not think we can talk about them with one fell swoop. They are complicated parts of the world. There are fights for modernization and to be honest, westernization. If we want to promote democracies in those areas, we have to probably better engage Arab countries and obviously Muslim countries and their supporters in America.
Next call, Las Vegas, Nevada. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hello. I'm calling from Las Vegas. My question to you is, how do you feel about the current situation going on here in the States in regards to perhaps the racism that is being felt by Arab and Muslim groups here in the United States, feeling that they have in no way anything to do with what has occurred, and in many ways to try to support local policy and also foreign policy, and have condemned any attacks against any civilian populations whatsoever, but there's still some animosity being felt. In some ways, a lot of people feel somewhat threatened and don't feel safe going to school.
Thanks.
Right. I mean, I would suspect that there was no ethnic community or religious community in America more upset by word that we're getting links to Islam and Arab countries with this terrorism event than Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, because one, they are law-abiding Americans, citizens who support America, and two, they know what happens after incidents like this, as we're starting to hear now at various mosques, vigilantes, people thinking that because some people who claim that they support Islam, and no one should think that Bin Laden's interpretation of Islam is really the interpretation of Islam, that they go after all Muslims and all Arab Americans. And it's a real challenge right now, to be quite honest, for law enforcement. If it is true that Arabs and Muslims, or be more specific, Arab Muslims are involved with this incident, how is the law enforcement community going to relate to and work with and cooperate with Arab and Muslim communities in America? It has been a historic struggle on both sides. Law enforcement communities, I think, often looks, especially ever since the rise of terrorism, looks at the Arab American Muslim communities in America with a certain amount of distrust. There's not a lot of communication with them or cooperation, and people in these communities are often recent immigrants. They come from countries where you do not, where you're terrified of law enforcement agencies. And so I hope that through this, there can be some better cooperation and community between the United States government and a huge population and growing population in America. I am on all these websites because of the work I do, where I get all these hits from Islamic and Muslim groups. And, Tuesday by 10:30 a.m., these groups were out there not only condemning the attacks, but urging that it was, in fact, part of their faith to give blood at this time, to go to New York, to work and to volunteer. And I think that's the spirit that everyone in America should remember that exists within those communities.
Juliette Kayyem is our guest. She's in Boston this morning, and she's a 1995 graduate of Harvard Law School, got her undergraduate degree in 1991 from Harvard. Our next call is from Duluth, Minnesota. Hello.
Yeah, hi. This is Jim from Duluth.
Good morning.
Please go ahead, sir. You're on the air.
Okay, thank you. What I'd like to ask your guest is the deregulation of both the airlines and the railroads. There's safety rules and inspections, and I think that that could have really been a problem over the last, or I think it was Reagan and Bush who done a lot of deregulating.
Thanks, and we'll let you go, sir, because I think you're getting feedback. Let me go to the subject of the half hour. Osama Bin Laden. How much have you studied him?
Extensively. When I served on the commission, I mean, he's obviously been the focus of people within the terrorism field. I think both rightly and wrongly. I mean, clearly it's very easy to sort of give him this mythic caricature that he is, all-powerful, all-knowing. And before Tuesday, a lot of people within the field sort of questioned his links to certain terrorist events, including the USS Cole, that the American government was suggesting. I'll tell you, one of the most fascinating aspects of Bin Laden that we were able to learn was through the New York trials of the 2 Africa embassy bombings, which just concluded at the beginning of this year. If you'll remember, all 4 defendants were found guilty, but none of them got the death penalty. These were the embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. That was the first case in which a member of a terrorist cell basically became a paid informant for us. He ended up giving us information. This was after the fact. He ended up turning coat and giving U.S. intelligence agents and U.S. law enforcement agents incredible information that came out during the trial. Some of that information involved just Osama Bin Ladin, the man, what he was like, his relationship with family members. Some of it involved how his closest colleagues and confidants worked together. So there was an interesting or sort of an amazing part of the trial where one of the attackers of the embassy talked about how there was a major fight within his cell or organization over office space and salary, which you, I think, would not think of for a terrorist group, but clearly Osama bin Laden was managing a major, basically business. The information also came out about how he was able to get money to himself and to various cells through the use of fronts, companies, trade companies, how they worked through more lax European and Latin American banking companies and were able to funnel money. So really that trial, which concluded, was incredibly helpful in terms of finding out sort of more about the structure of bin Laden. But I will tell you, I mean, if we do eventually link this to bin Laden, or at least to members of, or supporters, it might be unclear how much bin Laden knew of the specifics, and there may have just been a date pick. What we're learning, at least what's coming out now, and obviously we're still going to have to wait to see what's truth and what's rumor, is a new kind of terrorist, what one might call the assimilated terrorist. Before, at least in America, we suspected that these men, worked very clandestine, sort of never related to America at large. At least that was the case with the supporters of the Sheikh who did the first World Trade Center bombing. This group of terrorists, at least what's coming out about their lives, were incredibly assimilated into American life, including having children attend public schools, having neighborhood parties. These were people who were hiding quite openly, and that's a new thing for us, at least in terms of how terrorists might operate in the United States. We may be looking behind closets, and in fact, they're sort of right out there, in the dining room.
Next call, Randolph, New Jersey. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. What surprised me, and this may be a totally an important thing, is that these individuals who were taking flying lessons in Florida were caught in a bar consuming alcohol. Now, would a self-respecting Muslim do something like that? I mean, so obviously, so few days before the attack was being planned. Are we being obsessed with persecuting only this part of the population of America?
Right. Those reports have come out. I mean, it is true that Muslims do not drink, and the reports that these men drank not just the 2 nights before, but over the course of their time in Florida and wherever they had set up house has raised a lot of people's eyebrows about the sanctity of their claims. I think more importantly, and I hear probably the pain in your voice, is no one should think that the fact that the people who did this believe in a certain faith means that that's what that faith is. And I think the fact that they were drinking suggests that they have a very skewed, warped, and dangerous interpretation of Islam. And I would hope that we stop sort of saying, that these are Islamic terrorists, which I think is while that may be true because these people claim to be terrorists, it doesn't matter what the word is beforehand. These are dangerous terrorists who have killed. So those reports of drinking, I think, sort of suggest that these were men who had a very different mission than what I think true Islam requires.
For Juliette Kayyem, we go to Billings, Montana. Good morning.
Good morning. Slightly different question for you. Many of us here in Montana, and all of our prayers go to Washington, New York, and anywhere in the world. But we wanted to ask about critiquing the news representation of the United States, especially over the foreign services. Many news reporters on radio and TV are the ones that are interviewed by the foreign correspondents. They're not presenting us as a proud country, as the richest country in the world. 2 buildings are gone. New York is the greatest city in the world. They'll be rebuilt. It doesn't matter, 1 person, 5,000 people, we all feel that pain. But I don't see the reporters representing the strength of our country. We will get through this. We have the funds. We have the desire. Where's the pride in the news reporters? They're saying, they present us like this has destroyed the spirit. It hasn't touched the spirit in Montana and what I see in the people in New York and Washington. On Monday, I'll be very surprised if we don't all go down and buy stocks we don't even care about and make a statement on the stock market and to the world that we've got the means to get through this.
Thanks.
I'm afraid I may be watching different television than the caller. I think that the news media has been sort of representing that sort of spirit, that comeback spirit that the caller was talking about, especially both in their portrayal of the survivors and what's going on in the cleanup effort, especially your sort of coverage of Giuliani, who I think is, those of us who study crisis and emergency management, I mean, he could not be doing better in terms of what he's saying and bringing that city together. And I think in terms of preparing the nation for what may happen in response. As I said earlier, we need to be prepared probably for a very long effort. It will be military. There's no doubt about that. The fact that you have Rumsfeld and Colin Powell saying so, but it will also be political and it will be diplomatic, and there is going to be sort of a concerted effort now, and I think that the news media, I guess I would disagree with the caller that I think the news media has sort of engaged both the spirit that I think is bringing us all together, but also trying to prepare America for what it might all mean.
Richmond, Virginia, for Juliette Kayyem. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. First of all, I wanted to thank you for your level-headed approach and your uninflamed comments about what's going on. One of the things that I wonder about that they don't talk about in the news is how they don't approach the Israeli-Palestinian question going back to the Treaty of Versailles when Woodrow Wilson originally gave up the land, and how this was incorporated into the 7 Days War. All of this land originally belonged to Palestine, and most Americans don't understand that Palestinians are just trying to get the land back. It was taken from them not by agreement, but by the only head of state who's ever shown up to sign a treaty. Why is it that, I don't want to be empathetic, what happened is definitely wrong, but at the same time, why is it that somehow we aren't trying to correct what we did to them before, instead of continually funding people with money, weapons, and everything else to keep from giving back the land that we took from our ally?
Well, I think, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is obviously very complicated, both historically and politically. I think what we learned on Tuesday, well, first of all, I would like to say, I mean, it is to link the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to what's going on Tuesday, I think, takes a couple of steps. Bin Laden has, obviously, he's anti-Israeli, but America, Western culture, civilization, everything that we represent has been his focus. So even to the extent that he hates the Saudis because he thinks that they are too Western. Osama Bin Laden has not used the Palestinian crisis. He's used it in a way to get support, but it hasn't been his sort of main focus. What I will say is, I think, the Bush administration, in the sort of ending days of the Clinton administration, there was so much frenzy about trying to get an agreement. It obviously eventually fell through for a number of reasons. And the Bush administration, at least at the beginning, was sort of taking a backseat approach to sort of see if either the Europeans would step in, or at least the Israeli-Palestinian conflict might sort of get a little bit less violent than it had been in this year before we stepped in. I think what we've all learned is we need to have a very active role in that part of the world, not only because of our support for Israel, but clearly because of our support also for moderate Arab states. I was watching the TV, I guess on Tuesday, they showed a lot of Palestinians cheering in the street in Jordan and other countries, and those countries and those governments have a Islamic fundamentalist problem within their own borders. Those countries obviously condemned what happened in America, but they also are walking a fine line. These are, the Arab nations are not democratically elected countries. Most of these men hold power because their father held power up the line. And so they are walking a fine line between their own power and leadership towards modernity, getting their countries modernization, money, investments by the Western Europeans, and more radical fringes within their own borders.
Next call, Boston, Massachusetts. We've got about 9 minutes left with our guest. Go ahead, please. Boston, are you there? Let's go next to Atlanta, Georgia. Go on. You're on the air.
Hi, Ms. Kayyem. I'm an American first and an Arab second. I have, of course, I give my condolences to all the people here, because I'm part of them, of course. Now, what I want to point out is the media. I've been here since I was 7 years old, and I've observed this whole thing with the Arabs and the Israelis and so forth, and the Western, of course, America. The media has been demonizing the Muslims and the Arabs for years after years. Now, when we speak from a psychological standpoint, these Palestinians, when they're stripped from all the dignity they've ever had, they have nothing to lose. And there's bound to be some people that are going to be recruited into some horrible acts like this. So, here we have this big episode, and psychological assistance is to deal with that when these people for 50 years now have been just hanging there. Kids, everybody has lost at least 5 or 6 family members that they can recall, and this bitterness and hatred for America has bound to be growing and growing over the years, not just overnight.
Thanks.
You point to, I think, what a lot of people within terrorism circles and counterterrorism circles have been discussing, which is, we can have all these approaches to fighting terrorism. We can, attempt to extradite terrorists, bring them to trial here, try to spy on them, have military airstrikes, or likely what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, some sort of sustained effort against terrorism. But somebody has to start thinking about the root causes of terrorism. What brings men to the edge? And it may be that we can never answer that there are just people in this world that will never, who view what happened on Tuesday as their calling. Some people within the terrorist field who have done research on suicide bombers suggest that these are already people who are suicidal and psychotic, and they just sort of find some calling or some mission to give meaning to their suicidal tendencies nonetheless. But I think that in terms of recruitment of terrorist groups and how we can stop them from growing, we're obviously going to have to get to the causes such as poverty, such as, no hope in many parts of these world. I mean, you look at Afghanistan, for example. you know, these are countries where you are lucky if you survive past your first birthday, and after that, life is a struggle. And so I think that we do, but it's not just us. I think that, you know, the modern world needs to engage in that discussion.
Next call, Santa Maria, California. Good morning.
Yes, and I wonder if you're willing to go a step further and say that we need a new Marshall Plan, that if we are able to settle down the current terrorists, then our nation needs to invest substantially in the rest of the world to begin to do as we did with Germany and Japan, to give them a stake in world order. Right. When this first happened, I thought, oh no, this is D-Day. And what happened after D-Day was what we switched from being a pacifist, isolationist nation to being a war-oriented nation. And it has changed. And I was born in 1947. There has been fighting going on. People have been bombing each other. There has been terrorism every day of my life. This is not anything new. What's happening is that the terrorists are getting better at it. And the first act of terror happened before I was born. We have to have perspective on this. When we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, we purposely chose a totally innocent civilian target that had no military value, that had never been bombed, was pristine, and we demonstrated our power to totally wipe out those people.
Thanks. Juliette Kayyem.
Yeah, I think, you know, as I said earlier, the military approach obviously is not the end-all, be-all. I think, obviously, if we get into an engaged campaign against terrorism and the countries that harbor them, it is going to have a psychological impact. I think it's going to buttress America right now, which is feeling somewhat vulnerable. But I want to get to your first point, which is the Marshall Plan idea in terms of not only attempting to get to the root causes of terrorism, but actually assisting or engaging these countries. I think it's an interesting idea. It's certainly something that a lot of people have talked about, but obviously it's a two-way street. The Arab countries, no one should pretend that these are democracies either. They are monarchies, you know, dictatorships, and I think that it has to be a two-way street before you're going to get a lot of investment in those parts of the world. Our relationship with at least the Gulf states is based purely on economics, but in the non-Gulf Arab states, I think, you know, we need to engage them at least in some dialogue about what it is that's occurring in these countries that's breeding this kind of hatred and whether it can be addressed.
We have our last call for Juliette, excuse me, Juliette Kayyem, New York City. Go ahead, please.
Ms. Kayyem?
Yes.
I hope you will excuse my query.
Okay.
There's a difference between theory and practice. Academic people are well-meaning, but are not as sharp as practitioners. In my field, for example, I'm not going to get into it, but we in the academic world who are theorists, and then you get into the practice, for example, in the School of Business, when you go to when I was a young man and I was just starting my job, I went to the American Marketing Association and I was a professor of marketing, and I realized how far behind I was. Might it be that people as yourselves in the School of Government are trying to set up a theory, but practitioners and terrorists are so far ahead of the theorists that you can't keep up with them, just like we in the business world, or people in the business world, are so far ahead of the academic people?
Thanks.
Well, I have no problems with your assessment that people who are academics may not be the best people to discuss what's going on the ground. I think in the terrorism field there's been, and I did both practice and now not. People in the terrorism field do engage both the academics and practitioners to try to get a handle of what it is, who it is the enemy is. So academics analyze the intelligence information, at least coming out of the CIA, that's public, and vice versa. Because often, you know, you've seen people on the news. A lot of people have talked to Osama Bin Ladin. They are not our CIA agents. They are either academics or journalists. And I think that there's this continuing dialogue. But just to go back to your point, everyone, the intelligence community, the academics, everyone, except for maybe a few people who were sort of concerned about the prospects of sort of this doomsday scenario. A lot of people missed this. Obviously, we had no hint that it was going to happen, and we had no hint of the magnitude that a conventional use or the conventional instrument like an airplane could be used in such a deadly way. And I think what's more important, instead of blaming everyone, is to sort of figure out sort of what lessons we can learn to sort of ensure that this doesn't happen again.
Juliette Kayyem is in Boston this morning. She's a former member of the National Commission on Terrorism and is Executive Director of the Program of Domestic Preparedness at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Thank you very much for taking the time this morning.
Thank you.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us, and have